and trying to encourage people to be mindful of the importance of natives and the relationship they have with our ecosystems. And so I'm just really so tickled that your organization is viable and it also has such important meaning for not only the members, but the people that you interact with as well. So let's go right into this presentation, which I've been studying this idea of encouraging people who own trees to inspect them on an annual basis, perhaps once a year, maybe even twice a year. But hopefully you see my disclaimer slide. So I may be mentioning some products, and it's not because my son just took the bar exam and he's an attorney, but I just wanted you to know that when I do mention products or people, I am not showing any bias. It's all in the importance of education. And so the outline for today is to explain why is it important that we examine the trees in our landscape, that once we put them into the landscape, once we plant them, our relationship doesn't end at that point. And as you members of the Native Plant Society know, it is a relationship that begins after planting, and with regard to the inputs of management, particularly when I think of trees, the importance of pruning these trees for structure. It's a relationship that goes on for many, many years. Also, when I discuss the 7-step process, I'm going to be mentioning a couple of terms that I feel are important for your edification, because these are also terms that are used by arborists as well. And I was able over the years to distill this, let's say it's a 20-minute process, 20 to 30-minute process to examine a tree and to decide whether an intervention is necessary, or if you feel that at this point in time, everything is okay. We'll revisit this perhaps after a storm event. And I did not cue that storm for you guys in the Midlands, but it's really kind of apropos that we have a storm event going on. And after these storm events, especially if we do experience high winds, that is when you go out and examine your trees. And then we also need to know at the very end of this, when is it important for you to consult with an expert? And so you are aware of the stories that have been in the news for years and years. And it's not that I'm interested in the macabre, but I am aware that due to global heating, due to our inability of our indigenous species to be able to deal with these higher temperatures, with these unexpected catastrophic storm events, damage does ensue. And I was really tickled by this one. I mean, it's really sad that this person had lost his vehicle, but I have a photograph of this person that was taken in the newspaper that, despite the fact that she has that bumper sticker on her car about trees rocking, she still appreciates trees despite losing one during this event. But the homeowner is aware that there is maintenance required, but also, in addition, inspecting these trees to see what maintenance activities are necessary, or in some cases, what needs to be done in order to improve the health of that tree in the event that we may have a potential storm event occurring. And so, obviously, all of you at this webinar will not subscribe to this idea that we don't want a tree within 50 yards of our homes. No, it doesn't mean that. It means that when we do have these trees that are near our properties, it's important that we are able to manage them and be able to inspect them for the integrity of their structure. And so when it comes to us and our trees and our property, there is this legal term called this duty of care. And that it means that with the trees on our property, if anybody comes onto our property and has a negative interaction with this tree, it is our duty to make sure that the people and their property are safe. And so just a couple of slides, images I'm showing you here. Water oaks, wonderful native specimen, but when it comes to managing water oaks, whenever you prune these trees, these wounds take a while to compartmentalize and seal. And during that period of time, decay can come in. So when I see a tree like this planted next to my son's rented house in Rock Hill, that's of great concern to me. And then this is a white oak that fell 2 years ago. The woman in the home actually was hurt, but I was able to look at Google Earth and see over time what this tree looked like prior to its failure. Now, of course, they did have 65 to 70 mile an hour winds, but when I looked at this tree in historical time, it was topped year after year. And so that had compromised its above ground structure as well as its root system.
Dr. Polomski.
Yes.
Sorry for the interruption, but I believe that you might have moved out of presentation mode when you were showing your disclaimer slide. So we're seeing a different version. I think you have such wonderful images. If you could move in.
Okay, so let me see. It says I'm screen sharing right now, but maybe a new share.
Perhaps.
Let me try that.
Yes, we're there. You go. That's perfect right there.
Okay, I'm sorry.
No. I wanted people to be able to appreciate your images.
Okay. And so just a couple of other terms that are used in arboriculture is when we talk about this failure, branches failing, entire trees failing, we are talking about whether it's a broken branch or if it could be the integrity of that root system that causes this tree to fail or to topple. And then harm, we look at not only people, but also property. And when arborists that have qualifications to do tree assessments, they look at an environment where that tree is growing and they look at targets. So targets is a term I didn't include there, but targets are people and property, things that can be harmed by that tree if it does fail. Okay. So taking a look at this do-it-yourself tree risk assessment, my recommendation twice a year, look at the trees on your property. If you are an HOA, is there anybody evaluating the trees at the pool area, in the playground? The second point here, we are looking at areas of our personal landscape or in public areas where there are targets, people or property that can be harmed. And then with the last three steps, what we're going to be doing, and I'm at an advantage here having plant people listening to my presentation, you know these terms, you are intimately associated with woody plants. So this is not a big stretch for you to be able to go toe-to-toe with me as we go through these various steps. And it's really important too, is to write down, to photograph, document what you see in your inspection at that particular point in time. And then a step that I I have regretted over the years when I see something, whether it's on campus or it might be in my HOA, if I see something that doesn't look right, if I am in downtown Greenville and I see something, mushrooms growing at the base of this large water oak, I need to say something. I know the city horticulturist in Greenville. I need to contact Drew Smith. I need to tell him, share my photographs with him, and then leave it up to him to do something to take action. If it's our own tree, obviously we have the duty of care to take action. So the 7-point inspection essentially is first looking up, and then we look forward, and then we're going to look down, and then we're going to be looking at the various trunks or branches that may be associated with that particular tree. And then finally, we're not going to be doing any air excavation of the root system, but we are going to be looking at the root flare or the trunk flare and any potential problems we may see between the soil interface and the trunk flare where the trunk is attached to those roots. So let's go right into this. Now, as native plant experts, identification is not a problem for you. And when people have commented to me over the past year or so how difficult it is to identify plants, I agree, it is very challenging. But because of the technology we have, my gosh, I recently saw a study where there might be 8 plant apps that they had evaluated. So not only are there Native Plant Society members who can help identify trees for people, but we have a number of apps as well to help people identify these particular plants in the landscape. And if you're like me, I do feel that you need to know what you're growing in your landscape, because I feel even when it comes to animals, when we know these animals, when we know these plants, hopefully we get to learn about them and care about them and make sure that their health and their safety is taken care of. And so many apps are available. If you're interested, Michigan State University just did a really nice little study with undergraduates evaluating a number of these plant apps. Perhaps you're already using them right now. But being able to identify the species is just, for someone like myself, if I am looking at 2 oaks, a white oak and a water oak, already red flags are flipping in my mind here when I think of the water oak. And so when it comes to that first step, we're looking up into the canopy. And maybe you'd be surprised, not many people look up. Maybe at the stars, maybe at the lunar eclipse or solar eclipse. When it comes to trees, whenever I'm walking anywhere and I've got a ceiling of branches above me, I am looking up. And so what we're looking for, of course, are dead, hanging, broken branches. And so going into Florida, Winter Park, when I was in this mall area, when you park your car beneath a tree that has probably 40% dieback of the crown, is that a good place to park your car? And then I noticed here a water oak, 2 of them closely spaced together. And I know that these trees were there before the home was built. And so that can be of concern. So when I see a branch lying in the driveway, that should be a signal for the homeowner that this was not a gift from the heavens, that it had come down from a tree in this landscape. And that's when you need to start examining the crown. Are there any limbs that are failing? Because these limbs, as they start to decline, they can be extremely heavy. And of course, the damage they can occur, we are all aware of that. Downtown Columbia, I just thought it was kind of interesting to see a couple of leaning trees in Columbia over on the Clemson campus. Whenever we see these trees that are leaning, in some cases, it may be the result of a tree in response to low light conditions and it trying to right itself. In other cases, when you see a mound of soil on the opposing end of that leaning tree, that is an indication that this tree is trying to create reaction wood to support itself. Obviously, architecturally, some of these trees are very interesting when they're leaning, but when we start looking at leaning trees, whether they're leaning at roadways or leaning near a home, that's where we need to be mindful of the soil around the base of the tree. We're looking for some raised mounds of soil. We are also wanting to make sure that with regard to that particular lean, is this tree leaning further and further on an annual basis? And I know for a fact with this particular tree in this neighborhood, once that house changed hands, probably the second thing the homeowner did was they took that tree down. And then the other thing is, so we've got the crown under control, looking at the above ground parts. And now we're looking straight ahead. We are looking at the individual trunk, but also the branches that connect to the trunk. So some of the terminology that it's important to understand these words, when we look at these branch attachments, we call those codominant trunks. And we say that we use the term codominant is because they are all essentially of equal diameter. This is a Japanese Zelkova in Lawrence. And so when you look at the diameter of these individual trunks, they are about the same diameter, which means that they most probably have the absence or a slight connection between the adjacent branches. Essentially, when I look at a union like this, we are looking at a very poor attachment between those two equal diameter trunks. And you'll see this a lot. And the reason for that, I feel, is that once these trees are planted, they are forgotten. I imagine, well, people may, after the first year, make sure that water is available, but look at the structural integrity of this tree. It is compromised from the start. When you see this included bark, that should tell you this is a seam that has no attachment. It will eventually, over time, split apart. And we're all familiar with the poster child of codominant stems, and that's the Callery pear. But that's not the only tree. Any number of trees that are not pruned in order to have a trunk with lateral branches that are 1/2 to 1/3 the diameter of the trunk. When we allow them to have these equal diameters, they eventually will fail over time. And so we'll end, I believe, with this slide here, but it just really saddens me because of the amount of time invested in growing these trees to this very large stature. And so we're all familiar with that. The larger the tree, the more capable it is of sequestering carbon. So a tree actually gains benefits as it ages. But when you have a water oak with these multiple trunks at the corner of this property where we have a number of targets, people walking and people driving, there is the potential for that tree to fail. And so it's really important, my friends, that we encourage people to go out and examine these trees. And if they do find this included bark, to have a trained arborist to do an evaluation and assessment that we would call a level 1 assessment and examine the integrity of those trunks. So then a few other things that we look at with regard to examining the trunks. We are looking for cracks. This is a radial crack that occurred in a deodar cedar on campus. A student from my urban tree care class had the foresight, but also the wisdom to walk on campus, saw this fracture, contacted the campus facility folks. They bolted this branch together, and about 3 years later, they had to remove the entire tree. But they did take action because it was their responsibility to address this cracked branch. Also, when we start looking at these branches, whenever you see these conchs or mushrooms growing on the exterior of the wood, that's an indication that the wood has been compromised. We've got decay causing fungi in that wood. It has to be removed. It has to be addressed. And then looking further at what I really like with regard to strong branch attachment. So on the right, we have a large vertical growing branch. We have a lateral branch that is 1/2 to 1/3 the diameter of this larger branch here. We also look at this eruption of branch bark tissue. We call it a branch bark ridge. I know that if I did an anatomical longitudinal section, I will see these rings of wood that are overlapping. The trunk tissue is overlapping the branch tissue. And so that branch is attached to the trunk like a dowel. On the other hand, when you look at an included branch, we know that this branch is of almost equal diameter of this vertical one. This seam eventually will give way and the tree will fail. So these are all really important features to be looking at, particularly in areas where we are looking at the potential of these trees causing harm. And again, when I look at some of these public properties, I see this included bark here with a large branch that is about the same diameter as the branch on the right. When I look at the strapping, I mean, I trust that annoys all of you when the tree is planted and the strapping should be there for less than a year, but I'll find 6 years later, the strapping is still on there. Don't we care? And so we've got a seam that had been created here, and it's unable to grow over that strap area. And so this tree is destined for failure. And so another term that I feel is so important, especially when we talk about pruning branches. And when it comes to broken branches, dead, dying branches, any time of the year is the best time to do that. And whenever you do prune, remember the importance of this collar region. On the left is a crepe myrtle, and we've got this swollen tissue here, which is an area that connects the branch with the trunk. We want to make sure that if we make a cut, we cut right outside the collar region. There are still people making cuts parallel to the trunk. In this collar region are a number of chemicals that the tree produces in response to injury, which could be pruning. And so when you cut right outside the collar, these compounds, they're marshaled into service, and the tree begins to seal and use these compounds which have fungicidal properties to prevent the invasion of fungi. On other trees like a deodar cedar, you can see this little line here, and it gives way to this swollen area that is close to the trunk. So please remember the collar region. And so I tell you that I'm not walking around depressed all the time thinking, well, am I ever going to see a well-structured tree? Yes. And if you do hear somebody yelping in the distance, it could be me, coming across this tree. And it's just so beautiful to see this beautiful central leader, this pyramidal form, these well-spaced branches. There are no codominant trunks. And I know with a tree like this, it takes 15 to 20 years of care to create a tree that is structurally sound. And why not? I mean, it's like raising a generation, raising a child. It does take an effort. It does take time. But because of the situation we're in right now with regard to these catastrophic storm events, our trees need to go into these storms as strong as they can be. Now let's take a look at our last two steps here. We're looking now more at these cracks. These should be so obvious to people, and it's not. So when I go into a rest area in North Carolina, I saw this large open area that had split apart. The tree is attempting to create wound wood to seal over that area. But I will tell you that right now, decay has set in and the potential exists for a cavity or hollowed out area to form. In other areas I've seen large bare wounds. Other times you'll see this seeping of sap. There is a bacterial wetwood complex that actually exudes bacterial ooze, and it leaks from these wounds. That is a sign of decay. And I'll tell you, in some cases, the only way you will see that is by taking some time out of the day and looking at the trunk and looking up. And when you see this large wet area, that is an indication of decay is setting in, that some intervention may be necessary to examine the integrity of that tree. And so sometimes when you have poor pruning, and I know all of you have seen trees that were poorly pruned and they left the stub, or maybe they pruned too closely to the trunk and they violated the branch bark collar. The one on the left here, the branch bark collar was violated, and so the decay column set in because the tree was unable to compartmentalize that wound. In other areas, we see these fungi appearing, these mushrooms appearing, thriving on that dead tissue. I see this large seam in here. Visually, that tells me right beneath that, we have some decayed tissue. So an arborist could use a rubber mallet. They could hammer that tree. They could listen for some hollow areas. If they want to do a level 2 exam, they could use a resistograph. They could drill into that tree to evaluate the extent of decay. All of these tools are available, but it's only for us to ask because we realize there is a problem. And so I've seen many of these trees that are still standing, and maybe it's just fate, maybe it's just luck that they haven't failed yet. But this should all be a concern for us when we see these large decayed areas. If it's on the back 40, fine. If no one spends any time back there, it could serve as a site for wildlife. You know, it could be a nesting area for birds, for example. But when we start putting these trees into our built environment and we start cohabitating with them, that's when it's of great concern when we start seeing these cavities that are forming. And so in the botanical garden, we have a codominant trunked Lyrodendron tulipifera, or tulip poplar. This is a massive cavity. So far, so good. There is a path that runs around this tree. This is a tree that is regularly examined because of the potential for failure. Now, one thing, my friends, please don't do this. This is a this is a Carpathian walnut growing in New Jersey. My father, despite knowing him for a very long time, we talked about defects in trees, we talked about cavities, but my dear old dad, who is one heck of a bricklayer, chose to fill the cavity of this Carpathian walnut with concrete. Don't do that. And so from a distance, I can see, my gosh, look what Dad did. He filled up this hollowed area with concrete. And so after the fact, and granted, he was very proud that after maybe 2 years, the concrete never cracked. When you put concrete inside the trunk of a tree, it affects its ability to move in storm events. And so when that storm comes, this is a point on the tree that will not bend. The entire top will fail, and he will end up looking at a beautiful piece of smooth concrete inside a tree stump. But I'll tell you that this is currently being practiced. Other people put bricks or cinder blocks inside of these trees. Don't do that. It is unnatural. And the tree has a difficult time of growing woundwood over that area filled with brick or mortar. And then again, too, we are creating a point of contact where in the event of a storm, that brick's not going anywhere, but the entire top of the tree will be coming down. And so finally, let's take a look at our below ground area. This is not difficult to do as you're examining the base of the tree. We are looking at the trunk flare. The trunk flare is the point where the trunk embraces the root system. And then as trees age, the trunk flare widens. At the same time, we know that roots expand more vertically than horizontally. So it appears as if the tree is rising out of the ground. That is a good thing. We don't want to bury the trunk flare. What we want to do is examine the base of the tree, but also go a few feet away from the trunk and look either for soil mounding or look for signs of these reproductive structures of mushrooms. They could be conchs, they could be mushrooms. This is an indication of decay. And so this is the situation I was in 2 years ago. I walked down this busy street in Greenville and I saw this gorgeous fungus. And I spoke to our mycologist, Dr. Julia Kerrigan, who's also a member of SCUMS. I guess you're probably aware of that, the South Carolina Upstate Mycological Society. She identified this fungus for me. And so when I looked at this, I knew there was a problem because it was growing on the root system right outside the trunk flare. But what I thought I would do is kind of have fun with it. I call it fun with fungi. I decided to put my name on this fungus. Bob was here. And I guess that was kind of tongue in cheek, but I missed the point. This is a sign of decay. And I came back to this tree this past March, and the tree is gone. And so I trust that the city of Greenville, they do a beautiful job inspecting the trees on a regular basis. Someone had noticed that. I should have said something, I didn't. Someone had noticed that, and the tree was taken down, thankfully. A couple of other things we look for. In some cases, they could be innocuous. They could sometimes be a woodworker's dream when we see these swollen areas developing on trees. This is a proliferation of root tissue. People have described it as being like a tumor caused by these rapidly dividing cells. And over the years, I've spoken to woodworkers who turn wood. They make coffee tables out of this wood because the grain is so nice and tight. Go on the internet and look at the burls that are there. So on the one hand, it looks like this very interesting architectural anomaly. On the other hand, it could be a sign that there may be a problem. And so when I saw this at Presbyterian College, I thought, oh my gosh, it was like elephantiasis. Remember the elephant man with this giant explosion of growth? And I thought, man, that is so cool. But then when I went to the other side, look at this tremendous amount of decay in there. And I could only venture to assume that this decay extended way in the interior of that tree. And so by now you might realize this is a sidewalk. This is an academic building. This is a tree that really deserves further inspection. And so a couple of these things that we look at, where it's important that we notice that these trees have a visible trunk flare. When we see a tree that looks like a post that was hammered into the ground, that could be cause for alarm. And I really feel that in a case like that, it's important to excavate the soil away from the base of the tree and examine the trunk flare region, look at the roots coming off of the trunk. We're looking at the stem girdling roots that have the potential for girdling the trunk, preventing photosynthate and sugars from coming from the leaves, working their way down into the root system. The roots require 50% of the sugars produced in the crown of the tree. And when we allow stem girdling roots to prevent that transportation of carbohydrate, we will starve that tree. And so when we talk about that trunk flare area, this is the region I am referring to, the trunk, and as it expands, we have the structural roots. And then this is the root plate of the tree. I just wanted to include this slide in here. This is a post oak that had failed on campus. And it looks like this root system had been compromised. This root plate is what we consider the heart of the tree. It needs to be an area of the tree that should not receive any construction damage. It should not be excavated. We don't want to use a ditch witch anywhere in the vicinity of that root plate. So when it comes to the roots, I didn't spend that much time on it versus the above ground parts, but I do like this quote. And for those of you growing plants, maybe you've also had this experience that a lot of the problems that we encounter, 80% of them, according to Dr. Watson, are below ground. And unfortunately, it is that unseen area that requires us to go on our hands and knees and pull back that mulch and look at these stem girdling roots. And what's so insidious about this is that I've seen people burying those stem girdling roots with mulch, kind of like out of sight, out of mind. And only after 6, 8 years, maybe even a little bit later, these trees begin to die back. They begin to fail. And in some cases, they may even crack at soil level. So that's where we get professionals and they do a root collar exam. There are these high air pressure devices. Air spades is a trademark name of one of them. And you blow that soil away from the trunk flare. So we can see over time, this accumulation of soil and mulch has buried this trunk flare of this tree. It seems really out of place, but that is the sign of a healthy tree, exposing that trunk flare and being able to examine those roots, making sure that those roots are not buried with mulch, which can create issues with regard to moisture retention and other factors. So please keep that in mind. And so summarizing this annual tree inspection, 7 steps, depending on the size of the tree, maybe you could get done in 15, maybe in 20 minutes. We are looking, beginning with the above, branches, trunks. We are looking straight ahead, and also, in some cases, getting down on our hands and knees, scraping that mulch and soil away, and looking at the base. We have certified arborists that also have what we call track certified. They have qualifications to do risk assessments. So let me close. We all know, and members of the Native Plant Society, you guys are into herbaceous plants and woody plants. From the tree's perspective, we cohabitate with them. They are a part of our built environment. They give us the beauty that we desire in our inorganic elements. And so when I was in Knoxville in the springtime, it's so much fun to see people not looking at smartphones. They're actually looking at a blooming saucer magnolia. Or then when you look at these trees in Germany, how they become a congregating spot for trees, for people. And then remember those tumor oaks, sadly, they had met their demise due to an Alabama Tide fan. But think about these trees and how they were revered by the Auburn community. And I thought this was just really neat too, how people celebrate weddings beneath the canopy of these trees. So if you're getting the impression here that they're just more than trees, I mean, they're like are a part of who we are and where we live. And of course, we love these trees. And I really feel that as a part of that love for these trees, it's up to us to maintain them because our safety depends on their health as well as on their longevity. And so leaving you with this sign that we are the guardians of the trees. And I feel that as kindred spirits, your passion for native plants and extends to trees as well. I encourage you to share this message with the people that you interact with. Learning and knowing and growing plants for some people is rather an intimidating process, but we can make it easier for them. And I know you can. So I do want to thank you so much for your attention. Apologize for those technical issues, but I believe the next time I do Zoom, Bob, I should be able to learn how to share my screen in a short period of time. So the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob. We really appreciate you sharing your very evident love of trees with us. As you mentioned, you're among kindred spirits. We love trees as well. And I know I learned a lot. We do have, if you've got a few minutes, just a few minutes, we've got a couple of questions that came in through chat, and then I'll open the floor in case there are other questions. We had a question that came in when you were talking about co-dominant trunks. Someone said, if there's a tree with several trunks of equal size, what should be done? Should we cut off some of the trunks?
Well, at one point, I'm kind of happy you opened up the chat room. On the other hand, I'm not so happy about this question because it's difficult. It's very difficult, but I'm so happy you asked that because of the challenge inherent in it. So what I would like to do, if it's at all possible, is just work with an example of a codominant stem. What's really difficult about these codominant trunks is that, let's go look at this one. I'm hoping you can see this slide.
You might have to try the screen share again. We're not.
Screen share. Oh, okay, let me. Share screen. There it is. Share.
Okay. Yes, yes.
All right, so let me go to this one. All right, so what makes it a little challenging to answer this one is, let me just get into my show mode here. Okay, so this is a co-dominant trunk. And with regard to the age of the tree, this is the tree that we're looking at in the middle. I would venture to say that's probably a 12-year-old. And when I look at this seam, I realize that we should have subordinated or reduced the length of that tree probably 8 years ago. So there are two approaches to this. One is to essentially gamble. And this is what you're doing, because by gambling, we are going to make our cut right here. So this diameter of that trunk is about equivalent to the diameter of that one. That is, for the sake of argument, a 6-inch diameter wound. We are now expecting this tree to seal that large wound and be able to do that prior to any movement of decay inside of the tree. What I would venture to say, based on experience and also working with more knowledgeable people than me, this is a risk. And this is a Freeman maple. There's a possibility that if the tree is well managed, eventually it will be able to seal off that wound, and it may last perhaps for another 15 or 20 years. We really can't say. So that would be something to consider. The other thing that can be considered is actually to put a lag bolt between these two trunks. So instead of creating a 6-inch diameter wound and then having that tree marshal its resources to seal that wound, we're creating a smaller wound with the lag bolt, and we are essentially securing both of those co-dominant trunks together. We will have a little bit of decay, but it will be minor, and the tree should be able to compartmentalize that. So essentially now, what we're doing, Bob, and the person who asked the question, we're buying time. What should have been done, now let's say this is a newly planted tree, and let's say she's only 6 feet tall. First of all, Bob, I would say shame on you for buying a tree like that. But then again, too, I understand times are tight, all right? You found it was discounted, so now you have to correct this. What I would do if I inherited this tree, I would look at this as being my central dominant trunk, and I would cut back, and the term is called subordination. I would remove a portion of this branch to a lower level. At the same time, I would cut one of these laterals back to another side branch. What I am doing is I am telling this tree, you need to grow in this pyramidal form. You are my central leader. You are the dominant peak of that tree. All these other branches are subordinated, and they will not be creating codominant stems, but they will be growing stems that will have strong branch attachments. And so I will tell you that one other option you could probably pursue, and this is another one. There's a possibility that instead of removing all of this wood that may have taken 6, 7 years to grow, what we could do is instead subordinate it to, let's say, this level here. So instead of cutting it back at its point of origin, let's take a portion of the top off. It still doesn't alleviate the stress that we have here, but there is an outside probability that it will slow down the growth of this branch, and eventually over time, as it expands in growth, it may eventually start developing reaction wood to resolve that codominant issue. So I should have mentioned that first. So in the grand scheme of things, number one, I would try to avoid codominance. If I do have that, I would try to subordinate to a lateral limb, making sure that the limb that remains will not be as tall as my dominant central leader here at the top. My third option would be to bolt the tree. And then my last option would be to go ahead and create a very large wound.
Thank you. I think that's very helpful. We have another, looks like there's a lot of interest in pruning of trees. We had
and there
question.
Should be.
Indeed. We have had many issues here in Columbia, and you may have in the Greenville and Clemson areas as well, issues with some what I would call very poor pruning of trees, particularly where power lines were involved. And someone was curious if there are laws to protect trees when the power company or city trims them so that they are lopsided or malformed.
Wow, Bob, that was another good. Can't you guys ask me easy stuff? When we plant trees, remember, it's the branches on top, roots on the bottom. Just kidding. I had looked into this for many years, and I remember I had responded to this question a while back, but as I recall from my discussions and my research, my understanding is that the electric cooperatives, they manage that space, and I forget what they call that zone on our properties, that utilities manage. Mm-hmm. There's a term that describes that space for utilities, water, electric. So when it comes to the utility, electricity trumps everything. That we have to have electricity. And in the event that we do have these barriers, trees, for example, it is the purview of the utility company to create that space. With regard to creating that space, we do have a certification program for people that manage trees and power lines. It doesn't mean that a utility company has to hire those companies to do that, but these certification programs exist. And I feel that it's important for us, especially when we are in the vicinity of these trees, if we do see that these trees have not been pruned properly, that we do contact the electric cooperative. So I'm not aware of any municipal ordinances. Again, knowing that the electric company, their job is to provide service to customers. And what I have seen is actually a mixed bag. In some cases, I have seen, and I'm not sure if these companies are contracted out, subcontracted, but they'll reduce the height of the tree. And then next year, after topping, 3 or 4 feet of growth will once again occupy those power lines. And that's unacceptable. But if perhaps, again, communicating with the electric company, all this information is available through the International Society of Arboriculture. They have information on proper pruning. Now, for those of us who appreciate structural pruning, there are actually techniques that utility companies use that are accepted practices. So when you see the Y-shaped canopy of trees growing beneath power lines, that is an acceptable practice. Those limbs have been cut back or reduced to the trunk, and that is an acceptable, viable way of managing the tree. Now, granted, all of us will consider that as not being a tree anymore because it looks like the letter Y, but that is an acceptable practice. What I like to do, Bob, is to go back in time and wonder who in the world decided to specify a 40-foot tree beneath power lines that'll be 20 feet tall.
Right.
And so I know with the nursery industry, Schmidt Sons and Company out west, they've got utility trees. There's a whole list of trees that they recommend for growing beneath power lines. All right, so we need to go back again in time and try to do the right thing.
We just, interestingly, we just worked, a group within our organization worked with Dominion Energy to develop a list of native plants that could be planted under power lines that would not grow tall enough to be a problem, and would
Yes.
provide good habitat and for native plants and
Excellent.
native animals. Excuse me.
That's great.
Yeah, they were happy to have the input. They seem so. They there are positive, proactive ways you can go at this too, I suppose.
Wonderful. That's really
you good. You mentioned certification, and you mentioned the International Society of Arboriculture. We had a question: are there other reputable organizations beside? I guess they go by. Do they go by ISA? I don't know that certify arborists. Are there? Do you know of other?
Yes.
Certifying organizations.
Fact, Bob, what I like to do is after this meeting, I'm going to share with you organizations and their web addresses.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
You can share it. But right off the top, there is the ISA, but also there is the National Consulting Arborists Association. And so those are two important associations that have certification programs. One deals with the certification of consulting arborists. And then the ISA, they have a special tree risk assessment qualification that they have for their certified arborists. And so in this email that I'll share with you, that's something I've been sharing with people, that when they do feel that they've got an important tree that may be in decline, I give them the opportunity to look at these two international organizations and have them decide which one they'd like to go with. Mm. And one little bit of advice that I had learned, sadly, a few months ago is if you ever have to prune a tree while standing on a ladder, don't do it. So my personal story, I was pruning a friend's apple tree and they loaned this very rickety aluminum ladder. And you ever have those moments, Bob, where you realize you reach your tipping point and you're thinking, I'm going down. Well, that ladder just doesn't exist anymore. But I learned my lesson that once Bob goes one step off the ground, it's time for him to put the pruning loppers away and call someone who's experienced at that. So be careful, my friends.
Very good. Listen, I know we're just past the 1 hour mark. I want to be respectful of your time and everyone else's. Most of the other comments that we have in the chat room are thanking you for a wonderful presentation.